Double the play, double the fun, and potentially double the work. But the story is not as simple as it seems. An undoubtedly cool look into our smartphone future, or what it could be, gets bogged down by problems we are still having today. It's Joshua Vergara, what's going on everybody, and this is our full review of the ZTE Axon M. Obviously, this phone is a foldable device with two screens comprising the outer shell, and at first glance when it is closed it might look like the original Nintendo DS. Revealing the two displays shows the 5.2-inch Full HD IPS panels that can be used either independently or together like one large canvas, and that yields an effective 6.75 inches of what can be described as a tablet-like surface. We'll get into the actual experience of using these displays a little bit later, but one thing I do have to say is that these IPS panels are decidedly average. Now, taken on their own, it's 5.2 inches at Full HD resolution, and the resolution doesn't bother me a whole lot. It's more about the color reproduction. For a phone that's supposed to be literally all displays all the time, it doesn't really scream eye candy when the experience of looking at these things for media or gaming hasn't exactly been on par with plenty of other flagships. There's very little to say about the inner portion. After all, the camera's not even found there, it's found atop the main display, and it is used for both rear and front-facing functions. All of the buttons are to the left of the main screen, including the power button, which has a fingerprint sensor embedded in it. Unfortunately, the power button is a little bit recessed into the body of the device, which makes it a little bit awkward to press, especially if you're using your right hand and you have to use an index or middle finger to unlock the device. There's also another button down here that can be used for triggering the shutter in the camera, and you can double tap it to even launch the camera. But since this is an AT&T exclusive device, what AT&T wants you to know is that you can program holding this button down to trigger DirecTV, in a mode called TV mode. Now I wish I could say more about TV mode, but basically it's just a shortcut to opening any programmable media application. It actually doesn't change the functionality of that app or the way that it is shown in the display a whole lot. Overall, it's the heft of this device that lends it a sturdy feel, and when used in the closed configuration, it is a little bit thick, which means that it feels pretty secure in one hand. Unfortunately, there's one big issue with this. A lot of users out there might complain that a glass panel on the back gets really smudged up by one's fingerprints. Well, that's the same case here, except that glass panel is an actual display. So the more you use this phone in this configuration, the more you're just smudging up something that you potentially will be looking at. So before we get into the experience of using a dual screen phone, let's talk about the specifications. And one of the reasons why I'm doing it this way is because the specifications are actually not the best. The Snapdragon 821 is what powers this with 4GB of RAM, expandable storage beyond the included 64GB, and a 3180 mAh battery. We've seen plenty of other phones this year with single screens have 6GB of RAM or even 8GB of RAM and rock the Snapdragon 835. So ZTE is kind of shooting itself in the foot for not trying to put the absolute best specifications in a phone that might have to pull double time. And as far as battery life is concerned, using the phone in the closed configuration with just one display brought about 4 hours of screen on time, which is kind of typical for a full HD display phone like this. However, opening up the device and using it as much as I could throughout the day in a dual screen fashion kind of cut that battery life in half, and it kind of tickled me a little bit how much that made sense. I got about 2.5 hours of screen on time when I was trying to use the phone as much as possible with both screens. So let's get the camera out of the way as well, because it is made up of just one unit that is above the main display, a 20 megapixel shooter that lacks a number of enhancements that are kind of necessary for most flagship cameras. The main issue here is the lack of optical image stabilization. The app does feature quite a few different modes and is actually somewhat robust in its manual mode. But unfortunately, it's a bit of a pain to have to flip the phone around every single time when you want to take a selfie or just a regular photo. But the problem is that this shooter, while seemingly powerful on paper, just doesn't get the job done. Without stabilization, pictures had blur in all but the brightest conditions. Alongside this main issue is the camera's trouble with dynamic range even with HDR on. The lack of stabilization also shows in video capture, where shakiness tends to break the otherwise decent 4K capture. While it can be a decent shooter in the brightest of conditions, the way it falls apart in even medium lighting is hard not to look at. The rest of the phone is fairly standard, including a headphone jack and a speaker that is powered by Dolby Atmos. It's not the best speaker out there in terms of sound quality, but it does get decently loud. So if you're sharing content with one other person, for example, in the tent formation that you're seeing here, well, you might have a pretty good time sharing content with them. This tent configuration and using the mirrored mode so you can show the exact same thing on either display is one of the cooler aspects of using a dual screen phone like the Axon M. But how about all of the other uses for a dual screen device? All those possibilities are designated by the M in the soft key bar, which changes the display mode. It is actually possible to only use the left screen even when the phone is unfolded. There's also a stretched mode where both screens in portrait are used as one big canvas, a mirrored mode, like I just said, for the 10 formation, and finally a dual mode where either screen can be used independently for multitasking. Now, for the kind of user that quite literally wants to dual monitor Android, this is the only device that can do it, and multitasking is definitely a good thing to do on two screens of the Axon M. For power users out there who want to be able to do as much as possible at the same time, well, here's an example. I'm reading my script over on the left, and then here is YouTube on the right showing a piece of video content. It's something that I did very often with this, and there are a couple of other scenarios where this multitasking was actually fun and came in handy. One of my favorite tasks has been for gaming. In this example, I used Final Fantasy IX. I promise I'm going to finish it eventually. On the main screen, while the secondary display showed a walkthrough that I referenced whenever I got stuck. One of the issues I did get into sometimes was Android pulling focus. With an app like YouTube that is made to work in the background, if you have YouTube Red especially, it will continue to play no matter what. However, if you have something like Netflix, clicking on the Netflix panel will then pull focus from the other application and vice versa, meaning that the Netflix video might actually pause when you're doing something on the other screen. In another mode, both displays can be used together as a whole canvas as the software stretches applications out, and you can force this on pretty much any app. This is the most interesting, but ultimately the most flawed approach, however, where on the one hand you have the double screen real estate, but on the other hand, there is a distracting line of bezel that cuts right down the middle. Another thing I did notice with the display is that the second display plays a little bit of catch-up with the first display. If you're scrolling up and down applications like Reddit, for example, you can see that there's a tiny fraction of a second delay on the right screen as you're scrolling on the left one. It doesn't really destroy the experience of using this display, however, it is something that you can't unsee once you notice it. This extended mode definitely has a bit of a wow factor, but even those people that were impressed by it when I first showed them it got a little bit annoyed by those same nagging issues the second time around. And that's kind of the story of this device. I later realized that what I was doing here was tolerating some of the bigger issues, and those issues all had to go back to the same reason: the software. Not even mentioning the fact that the performance specifications don't lend themselves to the best multitasking in general. The software turned out to be less equipped for the task. It comes down to that lack of attention to detail. For example, why not make it so that the phone could be used in a single screen mode but switch to either display at will so you can flip it around? Or when in the stretched configuration, why does Instagram require the phone to be in landscape mode all the time even when auto rotate is off? And while we're at it, why is the original multi-window Android function disabled even when using the single screen? Maybe I don't want to unfold the device, but I still want to be able to multitask a little bit. And even better, imagine the possibility of having 3 or even 4 applications open at once, even if the specifications are already kind of cut at the knees. So if you haven't clued into it by now, the ZTE Axon M is a story of trade-offs. You get 2 screens on here and multitasking could be a joy on here, but it requires users to adapt and to have a lot of patience. Now, we give ZTE a lot of credit for even making this device, and we really wanted to like it, but putting an extra screen on a phone like this doesn't really change things if you don't work on the core experience first. And that, in a nutshell, is the problem with the ZTE Axon M. Now, if you're looking for this kind of form factor, this kind of multitasking, this kind of experience specifically, then that's fine. But for everybody else, having a phone like this is just not going to dramatically change your existing Android life. As always, thank you guys very much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this review of the ZTE Axon M. Now, I know I sounded a little bit harsh on the phone in this review, but the first dual-screen smartphone comes with a lot of expectations, and the fact that the Axon M doesn't really meet most of those expectations hit a little bit harder than we expected it to. Still, we like the device, we think it's a great concept, and we're excited to see what comes next. And if you really want multitasking, the Axon M just might be the phone that you're looking for, even if it doesn't fulfill too much else otherwise. But nonetheless, you can stay tuned to Android Authority for more about the Axon M and more about all of the flagships we've had in 2017 as we're drawing this year to a close. So with that in mind, happy holidays everybody, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, because we are your source for all things Android.